Welcome back to the Godly Impact podcast. When this episode originally airs, it will be Holy Week, the week that we celebrate Jesus' death and crucifixion and his resurrection. And Holy Week, the very first Holy Week, didn't seem like anything out of the ordinary. I mean, as much as it was ordinary with Jesus. I mean, nothing was ever just always the same types of things. But at the very beginning of that week, his disciples, the people in Jerusalem, the religious leaders, the powers that be, no one really knew and expected what was coming. I mean, he healed people, he traveled, he made the religious leaders angry again. He answered questions from the disciples. All those were things that he had been doing for quite some time. Now, he did do some things which seemed weird, but even this was not all that extraordinary. For example, one thing that seemed a little strange was he caused a fig tree to shrivel up and die. And then he did have the infamous scene where he drove people out of the temple, the commercial enterprises that were operating there. He also didn't operate according to cultural norms, although this was not something new for him, especially as it related to women, because he allowed a woman to come in while he was sitting at a meal and pour very expensive perfume all over his feet, and he received her adoration. He washed his disciples' feet at the Passover meal, something that rabbis and teachers didn't do. You know, much of the personal teaching that he taught that week for his disciples centered on telling them what was going to happen in the future. Not just what was coming in a few days, but years later, and even at a future point that we might call the end of the age or the end of the world that had no clear date to it. And everything that he prophesied, really, it seemed absurd. Whether it was his declaration that this massive temple that was a archaeological or architectural wonder was going to be destroyed to the point that not even one stone would be left on top of another. I mean, that just seemed absurd. Also, he did say, hey, I'm going to be crucified. It wasn't like the disciples never heard that, but that seemed pretty absurd as well. You know, commemorating Holy Week can seem absurd to anybody who is not a believer in Christ. Because truthfully, the whole gospel story can seem pretty absurd in a lot of ways. You know, the Apostle Paul wrote about this in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 18, when he said, "For the word of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but it is the power of God to us who are being saved." You know, Holy Week is kind of like a microcosm of life. I mean, one day we can be reveling in God's goodness, just like the people were when they were spreading their cloaks and waving the palm branches and crying, Hosanna, welcoming Jesus into Jerusalem, just a matter of days before his death. Then God does something strange, kind of like when Jesus caused the fig tree to shrivel up and die. And we kind of scratch our heads and go, what was that about? We see someone worshiping God in a way that doesn't align with our style, and we get angry. You see, that's what some of the disciples did, and probably other people that were there at the meal. And he's having a meal, and a woman comes in, and she has this incredibly expensive perfume. She breaks open this entire bottle and pours out all of it. So much so that the Bible tells us that the entire room was filled with the smell of this perfume. And there were people who got ticked off. They were angry about this. They saw this as wasteful. They even went so far as to say, okay, if you really wanted to give up all that perfume, then what should have happened is you should have gone and sold it, and then you should have used all of that money to go and help the poor. We need to be very mindful that there is a difference in substance and style, and how you may choose to worship God and how somebody else may choose to worship him can be very much a difference of style, but sometimes we confuse style with substance, and we look at somebody else's style and we get angry and upset, and we think we know how they should actually do things. The reality is, this Holy Week, there will be Christians around the world who celebrate, and you know what? They're going to celebrate by having an Easter egg hunt. They're going to buy the chocolate bunnies, and they're going to have the candy, and they're going to have Easter baskets. And there will be other Christians who think that is awful, that is pagan, that has no place in Christianity. And I'm not here to take sides on that. What I am here to say is there's a lesson that we need to learn about Holy Week. And that is that we do not get so caught up in how something is supposed to be done that we miss the heart of what worship is all about. And so the other way in which Holy Week is a microcosm of life is that as the week goes on, there's a lot of ordinary things that occur. And then there's a time when all of a sudden everything changes. So the disciples are at Passover, and this wasn't their first Passover with Jesus. They had had Passovers with him before. And okay, yeah, there's some things that are a little different, but nothing seemed that out of the ordinary. And then, in a matter of hours, everything changes. And they are thrown into confusion about who God is, who Jesus is. Have they been a fool to believe in him? All of this stuff that happens with his arrest, his fake trial, and his crucifixion, even though Jesus had been telling them this was coming, it was so far out of the realm of what they could imagine, because they kind of had things mapped out. They had a plan. They knew kind of how they thought God was going to work at things. And all of us do that. We all kind of have ideas about how life is going to go. And then all of a sudden, everything can change. And what we can learn from Holy Week is that there is a time often between when things happen that we don't understand, that throw us into confusion, that causes great pain and suffering, and before we see the purpose of it. We can hold out for the day, just like the disciples did, that even though they were confused and for a while they're like, we don't know what happened, and there was a separation between them, that all except for Judas ended up coming back together, and eventually they saw the risen Christ. There might be days that we are thrown into confusion and darkness and despair, and we have no idea why our life has been totally turned upside down. That can be from a health diagnosis, that can be from an accident, that can even be from a death. Psalms 30 verse 5 tells us, weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning. In John 16:20, Jesus had told his disciples what was coming. And he says to them, truly, truly, I say to you, you will weep and lament, but the world will rejoice. And you will be sorrowful, but your sorrow will turn into joy. Following God does not exempt us from sorrow. It doesn't exempt us from pain or suffering or from moments or seasons where we are like, I don't understand this, God. I didn't see this coming. I cannot make sense of this. Faith isn't a get out of trouble card. Rather, faith lets us know that our struggle, our weeping, our sadness will have an end. Pain for the Christian never has to be meaningless or without a purpose when we continue to believe in God's goodness. Whether that pain occurs because of our own ignorance or arrogance or sinfulness, or whether it occurs because of the sinfulness of someone else, whether it occurs because we live in a fallen world and God does not exempt us from the effect of that in every aspect of life, or Sometimes, just like it was with Jesus' death and resurrection, it is actually part of God's divine plan. We just don't know when we're going to experience the equivalent of our own Holy Week, when everything seems to be going normally and then all of a sudden everything gets turned upside down. But what that final week of Jesus' life on earth does show us is that God is with us and that obedience leads to resurrection. Now, let me be clear. That does not mean that it leads to the resurrection as we anticipated it to be. You know, when the disciples eventually saw Jesus after his resurrection, they didn't anticipate that he would then be leaving them. I mean, all of a sudden, okay, now this is even better than it was before, because now Jesus is in this glorified body. And now that he has proven that he can come back from the dead and there is no power that can hold him down, and he is greater than every power that exists. I mean, imagine what kind of amazing ministry we can all go off and have now. But again, God doesn't align with their plan of what post-resurrection was going to look like. And we want to believe that when we follow God, even when everything gets turned upside down and the things that occur that we never saw coming and we don't understand why this is happening, that there is resurrection. We want to believe in resurrection, but we don't want to start planning what life post-resurrection is going to look like. Because God had a much different and bigger plan than what the disciples and his followers recognized post-resurrection. It was a time when Jesus said, hey, guess what, guys? I'm going to be leaving you. And they were like, oh, great, we get it. It was like, whoa, no, this is not the plan. But just said, yes, this is exactly the plan, even though it doesn't look like what you are expecting. You know, maybe right now you're in a season of joy, and it's like that week before Jesus' death where people are shouting Hosanna and the disciples are singing his praises and everything just seems to be amazing and wonderful and people are being healed and you're seeing all of these great things. Maybe that's where you are in a season of life right now. Here's the thing, be fully present in that season. Don't live in fear of when something bad is going to hit. Fully embrace where you are. You know, the day that Jesus rode into Jerusalem with the crowd singing his praises, that was as much a part of God's plan as was his death and crucifixion and his resurrection. That wasn't just, a nice little event. That was also part of God's plan. That was a fulfillment of Scripture and of prophecy. So people needed to be there to praise and honor and recognize him. And so when you are at those places of life, don't live in fear of, when the other shoe is going to drop. Be fully present in those seasons of great joy. And maybe right now you're in the in-between. It's not all bad and where everything has been turned upside down. It's also not the day of Hosanna, Hosanna, everything is awesome and wonderful. Maybe you are kind of in those in-between days where you're watching God do some things that can seem rather, well, if we're honest, rather weird. Maybe other people around you are serving and worshiping God in ways that you don't agree with. I mean, it doesn't make sense to you and you're kind of irked by it and you think Jesus and God needs to do something about it. Maybe there's a bigger picture than you can see. And maybe God's calling you to be more attuned to his heart than paying attention to other people's practices. And maybe right now you're in a season where your world has been turned upside down and all you can see is darkness and terrible outcomes. Hold on. Usually there's a gap between the events that cause pain and coming to see a purpose in it, or that God brings a purpose out of it. I don't believe that all pain that happens to us is because it's part of God's intentional plan, but I absolutely believe that God's purposes can result from everything that we encounter in life. Resurrection can only happen when there's been a death. Otherwise, there's nothing to resurrect. And maybe right now there's something in your life that needs to die. Maybe it's a goal, it's a dream, it's a career, it's a relationship. It's something you've been fighting for and striving after, and God is calling you to let that thing go. And you don't understand why, and it doesn't make sense to you, and it's turning your whole world upside down. Well, know this. It's only because he wants to resurrect you into something that is much greater. Now, when I say much greater, that doesn't always mean that it is going to be more prosperous in the way that the world defines prosperous. I'm not saying that if he calls you to leave a certain career, that it's only because he's going to give you a new job or a new career that's going to give you more fame, more money. It might not be that case at all, but it is something much greater. We don't need to ultimately be afraid of death, whether that's physical, whether that is in other aspects of life, when we have the God who resurrects, who brings things back from the dead. Maybe you have a relationship right now. Maybe you have a goal or a dream and it just feels like it's died. Well, you know what? Holy Week shows us that God is a God who can resurrect. He doesn't just restore, he resurrects. I mean, that means something is dead. The life has gone out of it. It's gone. It's done. It's over with. There is no more hope. Well, you know what? Even when there's no more hope, there's always still God. And God can resurrect what seems absolutely impossible to us. Most of the time in life, we do not get a warning flag. We do not get a sign that pops up and says, by the way, just so you know, you need to be prepared because 3 days or 3 weeks or 3 months from now, you are going to experience something or you're going to get news about something that is absolutely going to rock your world. And it is going to throw you into a season that you never saw coming and you don't understand why. We don't get those warning signals usually. They just typically show up. And even sometimes when we look back at something in our lives and we're going, oh yeah, you know what? There were some red flags along the way. There were some things that God was trying to show me, but I didn't fully recognize. You know what? That was Jesus' followers. I mean, Jesus said to them, hey, I'm going to be given up and I'm going to be crucified. It was pretty blunt. It was pretty direct. But they still couldn't really grasp it and see it. It was only afterwards when they looked back and remembered what Jesus had said to them that they were able to put the pieces together and it began to make sense. So whatever season you are in right now in life, whether you are in a season of Hosanna and praise and everything seems wonderful and glorious, if you're in the in-between season where it seems in some respects like life is pretty ordinary, maybe there's a few things that seem a little strange. Or if you are in a season where everything in your life has been totally turned upside down and you don't see how it's ever going to be righted again, look back at Holy Week and see that there is purpose, there is hope, there is a God of resurrecting power that is as present with us. Jesus was still Emmanuel, God with us, as much in the Garden of Gethsemane, as much on the cross, and as much in the tomb, and as much when he was resurrected, as he was Emmanuel, God with us on the day of his birth. Well, we've taken a little bit of a detour for this Holy Week from the mini-series that I've been looking at in this podcast. But I definitely wanted to celebrate and commemorate this most special of weeks for those in the Christian faith. And I encourage you, come back next week as we continue and get ready to wrap up this mini series on how do we stop the splatter? How are we going to implement things in our lives? Just some practices that if we do them over and over again, end up helping us to not make a giant mess of our lives. Because normally it's not the big giant things that we need to do or don't do. Normally, it's the repetition of a lot of the small things over and over again that make the difference in whether we mess up our lives or we don't. So remember this, my friend, because it is absolutely true. You have an impact that is immeasurable, eternal, and irreplaceable. I'll see you next time.